catch up on the recording later if this is a helpful topic, particularly when it comes to applying certain concepts in FHIR to look back on. But we've got kind of a handful of community issue items that we thought would be helpful for us to actually go and action on today. So we just started discussing the stub value sets as one of the areas that we wanted to apply in the last round of profilings, but more from a decision-making perspective on the last governance call. And then there were some items in our community issue log around invariants. And so we thought it would be a helpful kind of like investigation, use of invariant tools, like a helpful exercise both in solving a error that is happening in our QA report today with the baseline that we need to resolve for spec maturity, but also a good time to kind of show off how we oftentimes do invariant discovery and to be a resource to those in the community that kind of want to help troubleshoot and learn to do the same. So those were two of the items. Obviously, we have other community issue log items that we could work on, particularly in the QA space that may not require voting or may not require like decisioning today. But I think from a going off and doing it perspective, this would be a pretty, I think we've got quite a few of these that we would have to apply. So is there anything else that folks wanted to ensure was on the agenda from the profiling call today before we dig right in? All right. Okay. So then I think we have a more interesting call ahead of us because we're actually going to be working in the JSON today to make these changes. So we'll have to we'll walk through a lot of it, but also I think there's going to be some where, you know, I won't have an immediate answer to something and we might need to kind of troubleshoot something together because that's what happens when you live edit on air. So one of the items that we've been talking about, sub-value sets. Is anyone unfamiliar with, we've been using this term quite a bit. Anyone unfamiliar with sub-value sets and what we mean when we talk about that? Just as a recap, it's essentially it's almost like a skeleton or a shell structure that we use. And it's not something that like is conventionally used in FHIR, because oftentimes we have, when we're developing profiles and our implementation guides, we have access to all of our kind of value set definitions that on terminology servers. And so they can be resolved if you give, for instance, the canonical URL that the tools that are using your profile needs to check against. In some cases, particularly in the case where you're writing a specification that maybe points to a bunch of content that's hosted by other people. We use stub value sets as kind of an intermediate layer to resolve an immediate kind of QA warning that we'll get that says, oh, I couldn't actually find the thing that you were looking for because it wasn't hosted at its canonical URL. I wasn't able to lean into the functionality that exists in FHIR to find and confirm what the values were in that value set. When we just point to a link and that the link doesn't resolve, oftentimes we'll get that warning. And so stub value sets are kind of our way of basically saying, well, we'll give you something to point to, even if that thing doesn't host all of the values and it just points to, here's how you go and retrieve that content manually. In the long term, from FHIR perspective and from a Canadian perspective, like we will not need this. We had a conversation a few sessions ago around, the terminology gateway and the terminology server that's going to be forthcoming, which will kind of resolve some of the intermediary pieces that we have in play. But upon kind of discussing this a little bit more with some of our existing implementers and with like the governance stream about what do we do in the short term while we're waiting for those things to come into place, when our implementers and folks who are trying to leverage the profiles are getting these kind of all this noise and all these additional warnings and there's confusion oriented around it. We said, okay, it makes sense to let's just put this kind of temporary stopgap solution to resolve the warning and to give a place where human readers can go and look to see where the value set should be retrieved. And so the two places that we had an immediate ask around we're practitioner role. So in the past, we've kind of applied stub value sets in the baseline and other guides, like on kind of an ad hoc point. I think today we'll want to, you know, at least kind of get to making them for these. Sorry, for these guys. You guys can see my screen, right? Nobody's talked since we started the call, so.
We can see your screen. Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. Okay. So we're going to work on these today and create the structure together. And then we will work on potentially, like, we might discuss whether or not we want to do this in other places, or if we can kind of meet the immediate need and wait for the terminology server to be in play before we tackle some of the others. But in the interest of responding to requests, I've got, I'll just pull up the definitions for, I found it, it's on practitioner role. And there's two profiles where it's a sub value set will be needed. So that's the general and the registry profile. And then there's just, I think, really 3 total stubs that we might need to use. And then I might just bring it back to discuss, like, after we make the change, we're going to make it live and push it up to our continuous integration build, whether or not from a profiling perspective, we think this type of change would merit like something that would be more in like the bug fix area, or if it would be something that would be considered more of like a minor release. So we'll come back to that after people have actually gotten exposed to like the action of making this thing and what it does. All right, so in the interest of sub value sets, what I've done is I've pulled up, I've got, we'll start first with the places, oops, this is my invariant tab, the places in the baseline where we have specifically sub value sets, and that's going to be in the general and the practitioner profiles. Sorry, so it's going to be in this one, and this one. So I'm just going to pull up real quick. So I'm in our general our profile for practitioner. I know, having looked at this, that, oh, maybe, hold on. I might have to just click into the practitioner role one real quick, because I was looking on our baseline site. Let me see here. So here's okay, yep, this is where I was looking at. Okay, so we can see that under practitioner role specialty, we have a value set here. So we're not necessarily changing the choice today. We're just basically saying, okay, well, this was previously identified, but when a user clicks into it, because this is just we look at the JSON real quick. Go to specialty. So what we've defined is basically just a pointer to the canonical URL for this value set. And as it turns out, if you do that, but you're not logged into the terminology gateway where that value set's hosted as a place for you to like download the content, you're going to get a funky error. So it says cannot be reached. Now, if I was logged into the terminology gateway, I'm going to get a slightly different one, because for folks that maybe haven't interacted with specifically the FHIR expressions of our subsets on the terminology gateway, one of the things that happens is if you direct or you click on or you interact in some way with this when you're logged in, this is the FHIR canonical value set, you're actually going to get that download. And this is going to be like the value set resource. But it's always been kind of confusing to a lot of our implementers in the past. You know, oftentimes, you know, if it's been a while since you've logged into the terminology gateway. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to keep the binding on specialty. So we're not changing like the target, we're not changing the canonical right now. And we're going to essentially recreate an intermediary layer in FHIR that has this with some human readable text that says, here's what you do. You log in and access the normative subset here. Show you an example of what this looks like in another project that we used of value sets. currently in. So I've got like two kinds. So we've got one that is purely human readable, purely descriptive, like contains no actual kind of structure that says values come from this particular code system. No like machine enforceable, machine readable structure, but it does provide an intermediary structure for people who are trying to say, okay, so PSCA cares about prescription drug form, you know, and how do I read how to access this, right? So if I were to, you know, as a reader, click on that, I would get to go directly to the place where if I wanted to download it as an XML, or, you know, if I wanted to download the FHIR value set like I did more directly just before, I could use this interface for doing so. And so the way that this stub value set is created, this is kind of option one. FHIRpath, I see you got your hand up.
Yes, actually, thank you for bringing this matter up. I was thinking it's the glitch because from terminology we use in Ontario Health in lots of projects, we use the value set from the gateway. So when in Simplifier on terminology tab, which we would click on the value set, it would directly go to the value set. But now it goes to the main page of the gateway, which you were just showing. So, and I was thinking like this is the glitch because this is new. It wasn't like that, and it is confusing because from profile I understand, but from terminology, when we are mentioning this is the terminology value set which you need to use, it should go exactly to the same value set by the link, but it doesn't. So is it some change we need to do on our side, or it is meant to be this way?
So I would say that, like, I'm going to speak first from a profiler's perspective. So the behavior that we want to continue enforcing in our profiling is going to be, let me actually just pull this up. When we define a binding, we always want to point to the canonical URL. In the past, in the baseline, some of the mistakes that we've made is like, we've tried to put other types of links here to say, oh, here's how you interact with the content, instead of what is meant to really live here, which is what is the canonical URL that this value set is defined at. The reason that there's been, I think, like, so in the baseline, you might have interacted previously with us, like having defined this slightly differently that brought us to like the home page, and that resolved it for humans, but it didn't resolve it for machines. And so we said, we want to do what the FHIR spec tells us to do. And we're going to point to the value set definition, regardless of whether or not that value set definition has been hosted on the internet somewhere our tools can access. I think is a scenario that is entirely separate from what we as profilers have to do, which is the end of the day, regardless of whether or not this is behind a login wall or this is something that's hosted on THO or somewhere else, we want to make sure that we use the canonical URL of the value set. I think the challenge is, I think that like a lot of times when we think about hosting and pointing to other content, because we are trying to do what's right from a standards perspective and like not create something brand new if it's not necessary, is that there's a lot of background work that actually goes into ensuring that tools can find things that have been hosted at this URL. And terminology servers are one method of doing that publishing. And that's probably the most common method, but resolution, I think, is like a separate side of the issue than like what we are supposed to do as profilers. Is there anyone else that's experienced that, like, that would weigh in further on, like if you've experienced this with other types of, maybe not on terminology gateway, but other places where you've said, well, it's going to be this value set, even if you have to download it from a different source? I know it happens a lot in the US, a lot of times when, and you know, no commentary here, but a lot of times when like content is maybe proprietary, or you have a really specialty focused guide and there's like a paywall, sometimes that will happen. But it just like makes our profilers pull our hair out, but that is one of the mechanisms we see.
The other place in US guides where it shows up is when the value sets are published on VSAC and the NLM.
Yeah, the National Library of Medicine, yeah.
And
So, yeah.
Sheridan, so just quick question. So, if any jurisdiction is using the subset, provincial subset, which is, so I believe they can put their link or their reference to that subset or not?
Sorry, will you repeat your question just one more time? So it's
No, means over here means, as you said, we can download from any other terms or any other value set. But what happens if we want to refer that? If you are using our system or we are going to our system, you need to use this particular subset as you referred proprietary or is managed by any particular jurisdiction or particular value set, which is very specific for that area.
Is your question more around like how do I further specialize the content? So if we said practitioner specialty, but for someone else's profile down the road, maybe like a profile for registries in BC, you wanted to do a smaller selection of values from the original value set here. Is that your question?
Yes.
So there's, okay, I'm gonna go on a slight tangent. But I'll at least show it because I do think there's value. There is this structure in FHIR, and there's probably more than one, but the one I have been using called additional bindings. And it lets you say maybe from a conformance perspective, there is a smaller set of constrained values that I want to utilize. I think there's something else on the element definition level. I mean, anyone pop in here that you can say, oh, this is a maximum value set or something like that, but.
Yeah, you can see that in the international spec on the language bindings. But yeah, Mikesh, one of the more common things we do is, for instance, some of the BC value sets, we reference BC defined value sets, which are a union of the national value set plus some specific values for BC, for example. And that's common. And then we're using a canonical URL that's hosted in BC, which will hopefully eventually be on our terminology server. So it's a little bit different than what we're talking about here, but because it's not necessarily just the externally hosted value sets on Terminology Gateway.
And like, I think, Lorraine, your example was like, it's going to be, it's more than just a subset of the codes in their original definition. It might actually be extended by additional, maybe local codes. It might be a slightly different scenario than the one that I was describing for this particular use.
Yeah.
But one thing that I've started to use, if I know, let's say I make an exchange value set and I say, I want, folks to harmonize around using the clinical finding codes from this hierarchy of SNOMED. And then in an implementation, let's say I'm doing a specialty implementation for a particular, maybe for oncology. You might want to say, well, for my oncological use case or system, there is a subset that is more meaningful for me that like I am trying to say, my users might draw from this more frequently, but it isn't preventing the use of the other codes. You might use something like, I think it's component, which is, there's a portion of the value set that I am trying to provide additional supportive documentation to describe. For my use case, I might be using a subset.
Yeah, yes. And I think the example that I can think of is that at least in R4, they switched it around in R5. The language codes had a subset of the most common language codes, and then a max binding of all of the language codes from IETF. So that's
patient, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great example. Let me see if I can pull up R5. You said it was on R5, right? Not the CI build.
Oh, R4 as well, I think too. But
so there's, yeah, right here. So we can see,
in R4 they did the other way around. They bound the common languages, then did a max of the all, and they flipped it for R5.
That might have had to do with them having the I feel like additional bindings is kind of like finally made its way into a lot more spaces in the base spec in the last 6 months. So It might
Yeah,
just
but
be
it was,
hiding that.
it is an R4 on this field.
And it is swapped. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
if we want to look at what the JSON of this looks like, so looks really pretty, renders really nicely in the base spec. But if you want to know what it actually looks like in JSON, well, because obviously I have a preference here. It isn't clear looking at me navigating the rest of it. Let me actually
Scroll up. Okay, or there.
or there. Yeah, sorry. Where was the other
It's
part?
right at the top of the table.
This one? I don't usually like this view.
Oh, that one. Yeah, no. Sorry. Yeah.
So if you ever want to look at the raw, because I have beat my head against the wall looking for this, and you just want to be like, okay, show me what the structure looks like in XML or JSON or Turtle. You can just like, rather than trying to find examples, one of the things that I often do is just look at the raw. And if we wanted to look at what was it, language? I can spell that correctly. We might have to look at additional binding, be more specific. I have to look for it. Patient dot lang. Here we go. Okay. So this is like the actual base resource definition. And so we can see here's where our value sets are. And the main primary binding is to all languages. So that's like when we looked at this thing in the base, this binding, it's like that version in the base definition is all languages. So it's like everything comprehensive. And then there's also this, no, I'm looking at R5, but in R4, they use the additional bindings extension rather than in R5, there's actually an element for this to say there's a starter value set that we like people to use. And I think it's, Lorraine, you'd called it like the common ones. And so it's like codifying.
It was in that structure just slightly above where you were looking.
Let's see. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So if we were to look at this, let's see if this will translate. If I can look at it in R4 real quick. Patient language. Okay, so this is the R4 definition. The reason I'm showing you this is many of us write in R4, and the extension is a good one to know if you're not writing in R5. So we have the binding in this example, and this always messes me up with extensions, but like the order, like in JSON, I know the ordering is less important, but at least from a review perspective, the extension is going to be coming before the actual primary binding in a lot of the profiles that you might look at. So here's the primary binding, right? So this is that languages one. They're saying this is preferred. And so, like basically to say, to maybe start, like our preference is the smaller subset, but you could also express, here's the much larger one that you could pull from and use the extension for doing that. So they use the max value set extension to define this all languages. So like there's a lot that's out there that we can use that is like help us tell the story of how we got to where we want in our binding without like jeopardizing the harmonization with the profiles that come upstream from us. Sorry, that was a long tangent, but I really like the binding extensions quite a bit. I'll put them in the chat if folks are interested in.
Yeah, of course, the other way to do that is just to find a new value set with a subset of the parent value set. Yeah, which is fairly common as well.
Yeah,
depending on whether you want to give the option or not. Like we used to in V3 bind to PCLOD for LOINC, the Canadian subset of LOINC, with the option of going to the full LOINC if you couldn't find what you needed. So that would be another place where you want to do that as an example.
Yeah, so let's look at actually the value set, like the structure of it, because we're gonna have to use this for the sub value sets in a second here. So Lorraine, in your example, if this is kind of when we profile, what we're gonna do is we're gonna follow these rules and the elements that we have available on the definition. And I'm gonna look at an R4 because that's what we're gonna profile in a second. So in the kind of redefinition, are you pulling from the code system or the value set when you're trying to express that under compose? So like, I think it would be, so the example would be you're
code
starting
system.
here and trying to do a subset, right?
Yeah, and likely from the code system, I would think.
Yeah. And so like there's actually an example I pulled up in patient summary of a sub value set that we started to have some we started to kind of use compose around. It's not for the purposes of slimming or even like redefining. Actually, there is one that would be good for showing redefining. But if we were looking at that value set definition, right? When we're like, there's like the human readable stuff. And then when I was talking about that machine, like referenceable machine usable stuff, a lot of that falls under the compose. And so when you're defining a value set in your projects, you might say, well, I want to include values from this code system, or I want to maybe include explicit concepts. Or maybe I want to include things from this code system and I want to apply a filter, right? So it's from this hierarchy or it's not this. You can also make exclude statements too. I don't deal a lot in expansion, so I'm definitely probably not the person I know is a huge part of implementing in FHIR, but I might, if anybody else deals in expansions and can explain really good use cases for them, that I might open the floor to that one. But there is a lot, right, that we have available to us, both mechanically and from like a communication perspective in this resource. In our stub value sets, we tend to be almost entirely almost entirely in the described from a human perspective portion. So we spend a lot of time writing about like or providing those links like in the actual description of the value set, because that's what's going to get displayed. But that isn't necessarily always the case. So in the example here in PSCA, we wanted to do the stub value set for how you interact with the content from the Canadian clinical drug data set. But we also wanted to put like an inclusion statement here. So we said everything included from the system, because it really wasn't for this purpose. We were kind of basically saying there isn't a tighter subset defined, like it's anything from this code system. So that would be utilizing the element around compose, include, and system. But you can get really funky with it, right? So we've got ones that are, I'm trying to think about one that we just did in patient summary for this one. I think it was like, we knew it was going to be a smaller subset and we had an ask to like add one more additional value in, and like it was in between releases of the subset that we were pointing to as well. And so we had to basically put some like actual composition statements forward to basically say this. Now this tends to be like from a base or a core or like a more like pan-Canadian perspective, a less common approach unless the like values that you're working with are very small. But I think Elliot raised the comment last week that when we look at our stub value set approach moving forward, there might be some value in like at least like leveraging, what was it? The compose value set element, so that if we wanted to combine multiple value sets moving forward and we knew that they were going to be evolving over time, that would give like breadcrumbs for the validation tools and the authoring tools to say, okay, you've edited this over the time, but I always know the combination of value sets that you're looking to, like, that you are expressing a rule for, together. But in the interest of kind of keeping us on topic, I think I know it's hard. Value sets are interesting. The stub value set generation, I think in our interim state is probably going to be more focused around like let's get the actual definition and a human pointer in place and created under the structure with minimal minimal computational pieces that will hang us up while we wait for the value set itself to be published on the terminology server. And so my process for doing that would be to one, identify the stub that I care about making first. So the stub I'm caring about is practitioner specialty. I'm going to find the definition of that on the terminology gateway. Let's see. Yeah. It might be under, sometimes the value set names, and I think Lauren was just commenting about this about V3 are slightly different. I think it might be SCP something, specialty type. Let's see. The other way we can get at this is just copy this real quick. And the name of the value set that we're trying to find is practitioner specialty. I've never done this, but I'm guessing it will work. Haha, okay, we found it. So I think I was typing in maybe provider specialty or something. So you can find it a couple different ways. I just wanted to track down the web page, which is this is the defining URL web page. All right, so when we're looking at creating the structure, you guys know that I am a copy and paster through and through. Sometimes that's problematic, but I'm going to start with the structure that we've used on other stubs in the past and copy that in and start like editing from that. Because oftentimes like this is a good way of knowing, okay, what are the things that like of similar nature that I need to make sure I'm covering, particularly because this is coming from the same type of source as like the information that we want to link to. So I've got my CA baseline project open. We have like we write our content, we push it up to a central repository, and that flows down into what gets exposed into our simplifier project. So I'm going to start by, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to just copy this name in right now. The name that we're going to be utilizing, let's see if it's going to let me halfway, is going to be practitioner specialty because we want to have it match. And we know that the value set, that the definition that we're looking for is here. And for our interim right now, we're going to want to make sure we're using the same value set URL. In the future, and what like Elliot had alluded to last week, is that when the baseline has a canonical URL that's stable and it's like what it's going to be in the future, we will like likely take a stance where we the canonical of our defined value set is CA baseline, and then it would be like the CA baseline's basically profiling of practitioner specialty, if we think about it like that. But for now, because we want this to be like a total flow through, we're going to give it the same, like we're creating this kind of value set structure and saying, well, it's hosted at this name. We want to ensure that we're not copying forward any specific information that isn't actually like attested to in its originating source. So I removed the version. I'm going to use the exact same titles that's used within the content itself. This way, if I'm not the only one that's making a stubs value set, there's not confusion around are these two things the same? I'm going to keep it status of active. Experimental, this is one that wouldn't naturally show up on a page like this. It's something in FHIR. I think it's a required field, and it just means like, are you developing this to play around with it, or is this something that you're expecting to show up in implementations? So most of the time that we're writing profiles, it's false. And then our date,
Actually, I had an opportunity to look up the definition of that element.
Yeah.
And it's basically, is this for testing purposes?
In terms of conformance testing?
Is this resource is the resource being generated for some test? Like whether you're, if you had a test patient, if you had a test observation, are we to see things flow through the system? I suppose you can have a test value set for whether you're testing publication of value sets or whether you're testing looking things up in a value set, I don't know. But I find that the label experimental is kind of at odds with
Yeah.
the definition of that element.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've never actually flagged one for true before. I'd be curious if anybody else has. Maybe we should have been flagging it as true all along. I don't know. I'm just gonna expand this outward. But it is mandatory in the base spec, right? You have to have a populator or get a warning.
It's mandatory in the IG publisher.
Interesting.
That puts a profile on value sets for publishable value sets.
Got it. Okay. I think date might be the same way, and I've always felt like weird about what to do with sub value sets in date, because in a lot of ways, like we're introducing the value set for the first time, like 2024, right? The 17th of May. But date is oftentimes like also used to describe like the date of the contents itself. And so recently, one of the more common practices that I've been trying to do with my sub value sets, I can't claim to be like perfect in this, but is to try to like, if I'm doing it at a specific date and time where I'm creating the stub, is to like use the last date of definition. It's not the best practice because like our stubs are really just meant to be a pass through, but what we want to avoid is like any scenario where we might be seen as like an alternative, or like there create confusion about these being different types of artifacts. And so if I'm forced, I will typically try to use whatever the last published date of the material in the subset that I'm looking at is. And then I'll usually do like a 0, 0, 0, 0. I'm sure that there's a better answer out there, but it's just the like one of those other things that I've tried to like catch as a confusion point. The publisher in this case is Canada Health Infoway. It's a SNOMED CTCA. So this is a national edition SNOMED concept practitioner specialty. Yep. So the National Standards Release Center is the contact for any of the PCLOCD, SNOMED CT, CA, that content. So that remains the same. And then our description here is what we typically pull from the subset description. So the only piece that you might notice is slightly different in PSCA that we don't necessarily add in to like all of the other places where perhaps like we're just trying to do a pass through and not define a broader subset, is there's some information like this is a broader exchange data set meant for operability and conformance testing. Like from a PSA perspective, this piece doesn't apply, right? So while I've copied and pasted from a PSA project, it isn't relevant for us today. The pieces that are relevant, so this little NN is like the spacer that will show up, because if I like added a bunch of extra space, it renders very poorly. So the part that is relevant: informative value set, normative subset. This is a hyperlink, and we're going to hyperlink it specifically to this VS value. So this is like the URL when you want someone to interact with this page. This is the URL that goes here. And that's what provides us the ability to provide that link for a human to say, oh, if you want to interact with this content and download it, this is where you go. Otherwise, if we put this one, people would have the same kind of questions. The jurisdiction again is Canada. It has a copyright. Let me see if there's a different copyright on this one. I'm guessing 2024 because of when it was published. And then the other piece that the reason I wanted to show you editing in this, so I'll remove the text because that was the other thing. If I publish it like this, this would actually be considered non-viable. It's a copy and paste weirdness where it will copy over, we skip the narrative. So I remove that because it will be automatically generated in IG Publisher. So when we go to save this, before we do, there's going to be one step that we take. So we're going to do value set. So I'll show you it in the baseline. So if you are an editor and you're wanting to create resources or update resources, create extensions, create value sets, and you are basically adding those in via the vocabulary or the resources folders, there's always a second place that we always have to make sure we include our updates, and that's in the actual IG XML file. And that's because for the baseline, we specifically use both IG Publisher and Simplifier as ways that people can interact with our content. And IG Publisher requires a guide XML file, or just a guide file, to indicate this is the content that I'm supposed to be rendering in a web page. So, and it uses these things like grouping IDs to specifically say, okay, when I add in a reference to my new value set, what is the what table should I render it under? In our case, it's going to be terminology. So we're going to find the other terminology sections. Here's our value sets from before. You can see we already have a few stubs in place. I'm going to copy. I'm going to paste. I'm going to use the, so it's value set followed by practitioner specialty. You can see that there. Copy that in. It's going to be practitioner specialty codes. Recently I found out that if you don't add a description, it will pull whatever your description is from here. So we're going to give that a try. It's not an example, so my Boolean is set to false. So if this was like an example instance, and my grouping ID, because I copied it from the other value sets, is going to be terminology. So I'm going to save this guy here, but it won't work until I also save this new file under the vocabulary folder. So here's my inputs. This is where any of the things that we're editing go. Value sets specifically live in the vocabulary folder. And to this date, I still don't know if we still have to put value set at the end of or at the beginning of our files. It was something that we used to have to do. I do it just to make it easier to find it. And it's a JSON file. That way I can differentiate between value sets, code systems, extensions, profiles, that kind of thing. All right. So if we did everything correctly, we should be able to run IG Publisher, and we will actually be able to, if I'm looking at, pull up the baseline in IG Publisher, and I go to our practitioner role profile. After it runs, if it's successful, we'll go from this eliciting that same download or error as we saw before to now seeing a page that specifically has the details in the description that we described. So I'm going to gen once and make sure I saved everything. That saved, that saved. And so you can tell I didn't go in and I didn't edit the actual binding, because I use this as the value set URL in my resource. Therefore, like anything that has the binding here, like, will already flow through to this, if that makes sense. In the future, when we change if we republish this value set with a baseline URL, then we will have to go in and change the bindings.
Sheridan, you may need to add into the IG resource that this is a special URL.
Where would I do that?
In parameters.
Ooh, okay.
Right there.
I think
Special URI.
is that to prevent errors?
That's to say that here is a URI that we know is not within the canonical URL of this IG, and don't complain about it.
That is super helpful. I don't know, it must have been maybe commented out when we were troubleshooting something at some point in time. But
or we've changed these so we don't need them. Like we aren't Yeah, I don't remember.
Oh, no, I think some of these we still have, but I'm going to save this. So, that is a super, super helpful hint because it is something that we often get yelled at in the QA for. I don't think that there's an equivalent in Simplifier. Does anyone know? Simplifier has like a claim.
No, because
thing.
yeah, simplifier isn't as strict on the validation, so I don't think it complains. But yes, that's similar to what simplifier does with claiming URLs.
Yeah, it's always just really awkward to be like, no, I really can't claim that because that really does belong to someone else and is outside the project, but it will show up as like warning you have canonical URLs in your project that like do not belong to your base. So a lot of places in Simplifier, we've just learned to live with it. All right, so while this is running, because sometimes my IG publisher can take a little bit, I wanted to, let me just see, actually, it might be pretty fast. We don't have a ton of time, but I wanted to go over one of the invariant tickets that we had while we wait for this guy to run through. And I had a chance to look at it beforehand, so I thought I had it up, but we'll see. If we go to, I'm going to keep this guy up and actually go to our issue log. Oh, baseline. Actually, hold on. CA baseline is where we want to go. There was a specific QA around invariants. And so, this was one that was coming from our IG publisher QA report. So if this is our build.fire.org, this is what's like when I said it goes to a repo that creates both feeds the simplifier and the this guide page. This guide page has this nice little QA report at the end that is basically telling us like live with our continuous integration, what are the like errors, the warnings, the messages, the hints that our guide is displaying. Sometimes they're things like, you know, your canonical URL does not match, like we just talked about a second ago. One of the ones that Elliot had done as part of his QA was a review against some of the, specifically some of the invariants. And so we have a lot that fall under the same pattern that basically says, oh, this constraint you gave me that you named CA baseline allergy, that's what we named it, has this expression, a FHIRpath expression, which is the thing that's here. And here's the expression that you gave us, but allergy, sorry, I guess it's, here's the expression that you gave us. But the error that I'm telling you about is that this allergy intolerance that you've put here doesn't belong the way that you think it belongs. It's not valid for what I'm expecting based on where you've placed it. And so we have a bunch in the tickets that have this same patterning. I think in looking at it, it's around like the way that we've applied it, but I wanted to, because Elliot, you had said there's these tools that are out there for FHIRpath, like when you go to troubleshoot things. I use FHIRpath tester, but it won't always give some of the answers like, oh, did you apply it in the right location? It's more like a tool that's helpful for saying, did you make your where statements correctly? Did you like have your closures? And then testing it with examples that you know are supposed to be intended fails or intended passes. Was there another invariant tester that, was this the one that you were referring to, Elliot?
No, this is not the one I was talking about. Brian Postlethwaite has one, and I can't remember what the URL for it is. Yeah, let me see if I can search.
Okay. This one is, I will say, like, while publishers running in the background, a very, very helpful resource if you're particularly like if you're trying to understand other people's invariants or you're trying to design them yourself. The reason I bring it up with this is because like I think it's really interesting in that it's kind of, it operates and it does this invariant, it's really just testing the FHIRpath. It's not actually testing like the application on a specific profile. And so the FHIRpath that was written for this, like if we had used this tool to say, oh, is this FHIRpath right? We would have said, well, when allergy code has a system of no flavor when it exists, or when allergy intolerance, so the profile or so the instance has a verification status of exists. Oh, it's just that this has to exist or this has to exist. The FHIRpath it's saying for this is actually correct. So I gave it an example that had specifically a verification status, right? But I think if I remove this, which would be like an expected failure. So when it had the verification status, the condition was met, the FHIRpath was true. When I removed it, the condition isn't met and like the response is false, meaning the example you gave me doesn't meet this FHIRpath. What that tells me is that this is good FHIRpath. And so when we're trying to diagnose, well, why didn't IG Publisher like this, right? The thing that sometimes you don't get, at least from this tool, is the context around its application. And one of the things that I have specifically made mistake early and again is applying my invariants on the wrong locations and like having to consider the location in the actual FHIRpath. And so one of the like, while this is correct FHIRpath and in vacuum can discern what it's supposed to, when we apply it, in this case, we've applied it somewhere on, I think, allergy code. So we're going to look for CA baseline allergy. It should be the first one, I think. We've applied the constraint here. What we've done is we've basically applied it an invariant that's supposed to actually target two distinct things on one location, and we've not applied it like upwards in the I don't know, element definition. I don't know what you would describe that as, but basically we've said, oh, if this is applied on allergy intolerance code, but we want you to be able to be like looking in other elements, that this isn't the protocol and the process that we want to follow. And that instead it should actually be applied upwards because it's going to have to transverse more than one element. Like if you, for instance, had a FHIRpath that said, oh, you need a patient's first name and last name, you might be able to apply that on patient.name because it's falling below it. But my read on this, and tell me if anybody reads this differently, is that what it's saying is you gave us this path of allergy intolerance, but you applied it on something that was supposed to be a codable concept. And this is not in the path of codable concept. Is that how others are reading it? How I would read, like maybe, and this would be like a trial and error thing, this constraint is needing to actually apply it upwards. So
Oh, hold on. So my interpretation is that the base element for this constraint is allergy intolerance code. Therefore, within allergy intolerance code, there is, that's on line 171, right?
yeah.
Therefore, on line 178, where you say allergy intolerance, within allergy intolerance code, there is no allergy intolerance.
And so the fix would be only removing it here.
I think it's removing that and code there.
Okay, so let's try that. So we're going to remove the allergy intolerance and code because it's already applied upwards in the path. So coding where the system of no flavor exists, or, and this is like to go to another.
Oops. Yeah, sorry. You were headed down the right path because we need to move up in order to be able to access both of those elements.
But if
you
it
were headed
was
down the
Yeah, if it was something like that was like two coatings, like it has to be this or this, and they're both types of coatings, then like we would want to apply it here, right?
Yeah, yeah. My apologies, though.
I've ran into that scenario pretty frequently as well, where it's really just having to remove, like oftentimes I'll put code and not coding, or sorry, I'll put the full thing and not just coding. But I think, and we're going to try this, the place that this then gets applied, because it has to transverse two elements, is actually here. So human wouldn't change, right? Because that remains the same. And do we have to say allergy intolerance here if it's like already going to be there?
I don't think so. Could you paste that expression into the chat?
I will.
Thank you.
We could try it both ways. I mean, what we could do is like, we could try, we've got two constraints in play, right? We could do one without it, one with it. So there's another place where we have an allergy not asked, which I think has the same issue. We could try one when we're running it through publisher. Just gonna remove the entire constraint, move it upwards. Copy this guy out, because constraints is an array. Remove this guy that I copied over. And we'll maybe try one where we have just the code coding and verification status. And then this guy as well. Oh, this guy's a long one. So maybe I should have done it on the other one, but we'll give it a go. Am I correct in the statement that you don't have to do both FHIRpath and XPath?
XPath is being removed in R5. And it was put in there originally with the idea that some systems may prefer to use FHIRpath, some systems may prefer to use XPath, and so they're redundant. But until your system officially moves over to R5,
That's a good
the question is whether it should be there. Yeah, it really depends on your partners.
So we'll keep it. I think actually we don't have to make a modification, but we're going to find out. I am going to quickly just take a look at the output. It looks like our last one did work. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly take a look at that value set that we had stubbed out. And then I'm going to run it. And if anybody wants to stay on and look at what happens with this invariant, you can, or you can look back on the recording. But I want to at least save this so we can attempt the one that we just made a modification to. Sometimes it takes a little bit. The computer's working hard. All right, here's that stub value set that we just created for practitioner specialty. And here is the web page that was created to surface that definition. So that looks good. We'll look to see if the QA report gave us any guff about that. Looks like it wasn't introducing any net new ones. Beautiful. All right, so we know that that works. We'll go through, do the other one with the practitioner specialty or the other practitioner codes. Folks, if you have to drop. But one thing I'm just going to do now is just run this once more. If you want to look back at the recording, we may continue this discussion on our next profiling call. Just a reminder that we are not having our governance call on the 24th. I'll put out the Zoom update to show that as well. Okay. So for those of you that are staying on, we've just made this. We're going to trial out whether or not we can get away with not having to repeat allergy intolerance here, given its placement. I've saved it. I'm going to gen once it. And
While that's building,
yeah,
I've pasted into the chat the Andrew Postlethwaite's page.
let's see.
Brian, not Andrew, Brian. All right, you go to tester. Okay.
Okay.
If you click on, yeah, so paste your expression in where it says FHIRpath expression.
Okay. I'm gonna try this guy.
You missed the A in allergy.
Oops. Okay.
Context is the element we want to start on. So I think it's allergy intolerance. And then click on resource.
Resource. Where? Right here?
Yeah. All right. And paste a example resource in. So for example, here's a allergy intolerance from the spec. I've just put in chat.
Right. Beautiful.
All right.
So this is, we'll remember what I did in, okay, beautiful.
Yeah. And then hit the triangle in the top.
This
Yep.
guy, the run, okay.
Yep. And if you go back to the expression, this evaluates to true.
Okay, so then if we remove verification status, which I'm guessing is there, it will evaluate to false because it's probably not using the Canadian null, right?
Yeah.
All right. Hey, this is great because this is like can do it with context.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay, saving that one. Even better. I'm gonna pause sharing for just 1 second. I have to ping someone.
Yeah, and I've got to drop. So have a great week, everyone.
Yeah, you too. I will give the reporter at our next profiling call if which one of these worked for the invariant perspective.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Elliot.
Bye.
Thanks, Eric. Have a great weekend. Bye. All right. I'm just waiting for the publisher to finish for those that are on and listening. We're just going to test whether or not that invariant, the choice between the two invariants that we were trying out here, which one, if they both were eligible with the expression that's in FHIRpath, or if the system liked one better than the other. We'll recap it on the next profiling call for anyone that's interested, but if you're listening to this as a retrospective recording, you will be the first one to find out. All right, it's almost finished. And we have a copy of what the example error was before. So the change that we applied was actually addressing targeting 2. So the first place that we changed was this first one. So we'll know if this has been removed, if we were successful. And then the second place was allergy not asked. So this was the second one. So when this finishes builds, we'll go to our output and look at the QA and get to actually see whether or not one or both of these are resolved by that change. So let's take a look. That looks like it was successful. Let's take a look at what our output says for all artifacts. And I'm going to go to the QA report. And we know that it was in allergy intolerance before. So let's see. So it doesn't like no allergy. And interesting. I don't know if this was there before. We'll have to see. But we know that it doesn't like, oh, actually, so it previously had, I guess, maybe 2 more errors in place for baseline allergy and baseline allergy not asked. So it might actually be that both of these have been resolved, depending on their placement. I didn't see this guy from before, so we might just take a peek at that really quickly. That might be something totally separate. Oh, this is, okay, I see what's happening now. It's basically saying you've defined a slice with a minimum, and then in the actual coding, you gave us a different minimum. So this is a different error. We've talked about this in the baseline in the past. We will have to come back to this on a different profiling call to make a decision about how we want to resolve it, but it's totally separate from our constraints. So like at baseline value, I'm looking at this and thinking that perhaps both are appropriate, but we will bring back the findings on our next call and confirm that's how other people understand that as well. But so far it looks good. All right, so if that ends up working, what we'll probably do is take the same approach with some of the other areas that we're seeing QA errors in. I think device was one, we had some in results, and start to clear the log of QA errors that we're trying to see resolved. And that will be all. Have a great weekend, folks, and we'll see you 2 weeks from now on our next profiling call. Thanks. Cheers.